All right, guys, if you are ready, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you all for the Labor Day reflection essays, right? So I'm pretty sure I got all of them. If I didn't get one from you, I'll send you an email, and I'll be updating the attendance grades accordingly, right, in online.coc.edu and Sakai, so you guys will be able to see that later on today. I want to go ahead and just backtrack a little bit, right? So when we were talking about just supply and demand graphs, right? So I gave you guys, for the week 2 reflection, I asked you to talk about what would happen to the Sydney economy, right? To the local Sydney economy, Sydney, Nebraska, right? To their economy as there's this news, right? I sent this news article out that said that the Cabela's factory was being purchased, and they were going to be investing in this new business and hiring all these workers, right? And so what was happening? So the event, right, was essentially an increase in investment in the region, right? And so this increase in investment, what does this come with? Well, this increase in investment is going to come with an increase in jobs, right? And it said that specifically in the article. And what does an increase in jobs give us? That gives us an increase in income. A lot of people that were maybe working part-time, maybe they weren't working at all, right? Now they're going to have some jobs. They're going to have more money to spend. Right? And what do we know about income? This here, ding, 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 this is one of my shifters of demand. So because of the fact that they're moving in, and so there's 2 interpretations, right? So there's really 2 right answers. And I kind of jumped the gun a little bit when I was assigning this. And I told you guys there's only 1 shift. There's actually 2. So we'll talk about it. But some of you were actually just having trouble with the whole notion of a shift in general, right? And so I got a lot of just like demand curves on their own or supply curves on their own, right? So remember, we got to put it all together when we're talking about this, because at the end of the day, what are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out what's happening with the price and with the quantity, right? And so if we only have the supply or the demand curve, we're only going to have half of that equation, okay? So let's go ahead and put that demand curve in there. Demand, supply curve in there, supply. And so there's some P, and again, this is kind of hard for us to think of when we're talking about a local economy, right? So we could think about this more instead of prices as some price level, right? So there's some price level, and we're going to get into this in more detail when we talk about how inflation is measured and stuff like that, right, in chapter 6. So there's some price level, and then there's some quantity of goods sold for the whole town, right? And so this is the quantity of all goods and services. And so because of the fact that we have a shifter in demand and it's increasing, right, that's going to be reflected in this graph as an outward shift in my demand curve. So it's funny because I had some people that even put the points up here, but that didn't go all the way through with drawing a new curve, right? So a shift in a demand curve means you're going to have to draw a second demand curve, right? And then we label this D1, D2. So we've got this P star and Q star, right? Those are our initial equilibriums. And then we end up at a higher P star and a higher Q star, right? So I would say that, just looking at the demand side effects, right? So just looking at the demand side effects, there's going to be an increase in the price and an increase in price level, we can think about, right? And an increase in the quantity of all the goods and services, right? So increase in the local economic activity in Sydney is going to increase as a result of this, okay? So that's one of them. The other shifter we could have thought about is we could have said, so that's one of the shifters, right? One could have been that one. it also could have been an increase in expectations. Right? So people expecting there to be more economic activity and there to be, you know, more jobs and stuff like that, right, are going to go out and spend more. And so this increase in expectations is going to result in an increase in demand. So you could have chosen either one of the reasons. The expectation one is a little bit trickier, right? You know, because it deals with like what people are thinking and their you know, subjunctive, right? They're like conjectural behavior, like what would they do if this were the case? But the income one is pretty straightforward. Now, there is a way that we can use this news article as evidence for a shift outwards in supply, right? So how do we do that, Chris? I'm at the tip of my seat. How do we do that? Well, let's figure it out. So we've got price level, we've got the quantity of all goods and services, Sydney economy. We've got a downward sloping demand curve. We've got an upward sloping supply curve. We've got some equilibrium price and quantity. Price level and quantity, right? And so the other thing we could think of, and it alluded to this, well, it didn't allude to it, it kind of explicitly mentioned it, right? It talked about how they were going to be building a shopping center too, right? And like a Target was going to go in and other stuff like that, right? And so that is talking about an increase in the expectations for the sellers, right? So the sellers, or well, I mean, we could, let's not talk about expectations. This is just going to be an increase in the number of producers, the number of sellers. So this, they said, you know, they were building, not only were they coming in and they were taking over that building, right, but they were also building out mini mall, you know, and as a result, there's going to be an increase in the number of sellers. I mean, there's going to be an increase in the number of sellers just because that company is coming in and setting up their headquarters there, right? But in terms of the economic activity, the company coming in has really more of a demand side effect, right? Because they're going to be hiring more people, people are going to be getting more income, that kind of stuff, right? The stuff that the company is doing has a supply side effect, right? So the fact that they're not just coming in and like headquartering themselves and doing nothing else, right? They're coming in and they're kind of redeveloping that area and they're going to be renting out spaces. And you know, it's like a land development project for the company as well, right? So that's going to be an increase in the number of sellers. And so what's the result going to be here if we just look at that supply side and the fact that, you know, there's going to be more sellers, right? Well, then the general price level of everything should go down. You know, they're having to compete for, you know, you got more people competing for your buck, right? And so prices are going to go down. It's like the more and more coffee shops open up, the cheaper coffee gets. And then Q star, there's going to be more just goods and services that are provided to the city economy as a result. So whenever we're talking about a shift, right, we have a few different things that we really need, right? We need, you know, an axis on the y-axis, right? We need an axis on the x-axis. We need a title. We need to know what the heck are we actually talking about. You know, we need at least one demand curve and one supply curve, and we need another either demand or supply curve, right? So those are our elements. And then in some form or fashion, right, we need to talk about the fact that, you know, there was an old equilibrium and it became this new, or sorry, the old equilibrium, it became a new equilibrium, and same thing over here, right? So you can do that with the star and the double star. You can do it with the arrows that I have here. I mean, even if you leave out all that stuff and you just have the arrows between the shifts, that's totally fine. You know, that's also, you know, give you credit for that. You just have to have something, right? So it doesn't do to provide me with something that's like this. I don't know what the hell's going on there, right? So I need some sort of either directional arrows, labeling of 1 and 2. You know, I should have my equilibriums, at least one of them reflected onto the axis, right? And then ideally I have both of them, and then I even have some arrows that let me know what's happening on those particular axes. So any questions just on the construction of those and their shifts and stuff like that? No? Okay, cool. What happens if these both happened at the same time? Right? If these both happen at the same time, great question, right? If we had a demand shift, so what if I told you that, you know, there was a double shift that happened, right? And so then you would have to have figured out that there's going to be not only a demand increase, but a supply increase. And so then remember, the more stuff that happens, the more stuff that we allow to happen, the less information that we get, right? So if we were to allow the demand to increase again, right, well, what's that going to do? That's going to pull the price back up. It's going to draw the quantity even further out. And so I'm going to end up with a P triple star that I really have no idea if it's above or below my initial P star, right? So it's an ambiguous change in the price. And what happens with our quantity just gets bigger and bigger. Both of those were to happen at the same time, that's how we would represent. Questions on that? Cool. All right, awesome. Get back into GDP stuff. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. So you guys have a test opening up tomorrow. So we've got 3 exams in this class. The first one is opening up tomorrow. 70 questions. You got 140 minutes to take it, right? So a little bit over 2 hours. So it's 2 minutes per question. It's open notes. You don't have access to the e-text or whatever, right? But whatever notes you have on your notebook, you know, feel free to use it. There's only 1 attempt. Yeah, it's supposed to go all the way to chapter 7. We'll see how far we get. I'm pretty sure I'm going to take chapter 7 off, and we're going to put that into the second midterm exam, right? So it'll just cover 1 through 6. So let's finish up 5. So we were talking about GDP and economic production, right? And I just want to kind of really, you know, quickly clarify with you guys that, you know, the real GDP, it's an approximation for economic well-being. But it's not perfect, okay? And so there's a lot of flaws that the real GDP has, right? So what are some of the flaws? Well, it only values market transactions. So what does this mean? Well, this means that, you know, any household work, any volunteer work, and any illegal transactions, whatever those kids are doing at the house next to mine, all of those are not part of GDP, right? These are not included in GDP. And the one that really sucks is the fact that this household work isn't counted, right? Because when you think about it, you can hire a maid. What happens when you hire a maid? That's a service. That's part of GDP, right? You can hire somebody to cook your food. You can order food out, right? And that becomes part of GDP. But if you make food yourself, or if you're a mom making food for your family, making dinner for your family, that doesn't count as GDP. If you hire a housekeeper, that counts as GDP. But if you're, you know, a stay-at-home dad and you're the housekeeper, that doesn't count as GDP. So our economic activity is really undervalued because of the fact that it's got a bias towards market transactions. Now, why is that? Is it just because they hate, the economists that first started this, like hated women, and they were like, that's not good, we're women, blah, blah, blah. And maybe a little, probably not. It's the fact that market transactions, right? We have data for this, right? We get data, we get prices and quantities. Walmart can tell me how many avocados they sold in the last month and how much they charge for each avocado, right? A housewife or a house husband might be able to tell me, how many meals they made or how much time they spent cleaning or whatever, right? But to value that is a very different matter, right? To give that a market value is tricky. So essentially, it's only looking at market transactions, right? And it's really important to keep in mind that, a lot of times we get focused on maximizing GDP, right? Maximizing all the goods and services that, we get to enjoy, right? But here's the thing, GDP, it doesn't always increase because of, so it's not just enjoyed, right? So I kind of miswrote that on purpose. It's not enjoyed, it's goods and services consumed. Some of the goods and services, when we actually, sell them or consume them or whatever, right? We don't actually enjoy them. Who enjoys a heart attack, right? If you get open heart surgery, that's going to increase GDP. There's other similar things, right? Every time we build a missile or something like that, right? What are they, bunker blaster missiles? I don't know, missiles, right? Nobody enjoys consuming a missile, but when we produce missiles and when we use missiles, that increases GDP, right? That's an increase in government spending. And so we have this fluffy, flowery notion in our head about, GDP and, it's all the stuff that we buy from Walmart and everything like that, right? But it's also, all of the money that was spent to clean up the Gulf of Mexico when BP spilled all that oil in it. You guys probably weren't that old for that. I don't know if you remember it, but all like all of that money was part of GDP. You know what I mean? And that's definitely not a societal good, right? Like you couldn't eat shrimp or fish out of the Gulf of Mexico. You probably still can't without having some like oil in the shrimp, like you can see it. I never thought I would be wanting farm fished food, but after that disaster, I was like, fresh seafood in Florida, I'm okay. So what else though? What else, right? Well, it also it omits leisure time, right? The amount of leisure has increased, quite a bit in the last 1,000 years, right? As we learn because of, Labor Day and stuff, right? The work week, has decreased, right? People aren't, there's no child labor, right? So people are entering the workforce at a labor force. We're going to define that in a bit. The labor force, people enter it at later stages, at later ages. Right, so you get to be a kid, you get to run around and play hide and seek and capture the flag and all that stuff, right? Instead of having to work from sunrise to sunset as they did back in the good old days. And then people retire earlier and live longer. And so what kind of also goes in hand with that, that environmental quality, so there are issues just with environmental quality. Right? And part of this is the fact that, it's difficult to value clean water or clean air, right? You can go around and you can ask people, how much would you be willing to pay? But I mean, that's like you're just like pulling random people out of the mall. You know what I mean? And they're just like trying to get their movie tickets, and they're just being like, I don't know, like $500 a year. You know what I mean? Like, and so like at the end of the day, we have no idea how much these things are valuable to us until they're gone, right? So now would be a really great time to ask the people of what California and Oregon and Fort Collins, right? How much do you value clean air, right? Because they're covered in forest fire smoke, right? And so this, they're this thing that we've taken for granted, right? This environmental, good, right? The fact that we can breathe the air and it doesn't harm you, right? It's very, very difficult to put a value on that, and so as a result, we end up getting a lot of resource depletion. As a result of this kind of stuff, we end up getting resource depletion. There's no adjustment made for the resource availability. What about, does it actually capture? So we know that it captures not everything good, right? But it's the best, worst thing we got, right? It's the best, worst measure we have. So best, worst, right? So we know that it's bad, but all the rest of them are even worse. It's the best, worst measure that we have, right? And while it doesn't capture the impact of inequality, which we'll talk about at a later date, right? And this is, essentially the 1%, top 1% of households owning something like 50% of the US wealth. So it doesn't capture that, which is alarming and continues to grow at a really alarming rate, right? But what it does do, it does give us a basic indicator of well-being. So, an illustration, if we were to take a look at, so this is all from the United Nations. And they went ahead and they split up all the countries into, very high human development, and then high human development, and then medium, and then low. And then they said, okay, so they kind of made these segments, and you can argue that these segments are a little bit arbitrary, but at a certain point you've got to segment it, right? You can think of them as just quartiles, right? The bottom 25% is the low, the top 25% is the high. And so when we talk about the GDP, so first of all, I'm not going to bring in the GDP per person because let's just get a sense of what this means by human development, right? So let's talk about the expected years of schooling. Expected schooling, right, for children. And so for high human development, what would we expect this to be, right? Probably over 12, right? We know that everybody goes to grade 12. We know that a lot of people go more than that, right? We know that some people like me make the mistake of continuing to go after undergraduates. So the actual expected years of schooling, the average is 16.4, right? Also, that might include kindergarten or whatever, you know what I mean? So the 14th year might be the first year of undergrad rather than. What about in high human development, right? High human development, that's, not too far off, 13.8. In medium human development, we're starting to get a little bit lower than a high school education. And in low human development, we've got an average of 9.3 years of schooling, right? So not quite, but almost half of the years of schooling that those same children get in the United States or Europe or whatever, right? What about the under 5 mortality rate? And so this is something that, we really take for granted in the United States, right? So this is per 1,000 babies. And so, this, like, it used to be that you would be lucky if like 4 of 10 of your children survived, right? Like they had so many children, not only because they were agricultural assets, the more children you had, the more hands you had to help on the farm, but they also had children because they would die, and like, so you just had to have redundancy, right? And that is still a reality in part of the world, right? We live in this really nice place where it's 6 out of 1,000, right? But as soon as we start to kind of go down, right, that starts to increase in a big way till we get to 84, right? So that's almost 1 in 10 babies that dies in those low-income countries. And so, all right, so we've talked about, human capital with schooling. We've talked about, kind of health, right? The under 5 mortality rate is kind of a general measure of health in hospitals and things like that, right? Now let's talk about the expected life expectancy, right? So life expectancy. And this is at birth in years, but you guys already kind of know that. All right, so what do we think it is? We can play a guess game here. What do we think it is for the United States and other places that are very high human development? What's the life expectancy? How old can we expect to live? Yeah, so it's 79.4 with everybody else. But yeah, we're probably a little bit higher at 84. Probably somewhere in the middle there. When we go to high, that decreases to 75.5, medium, 68.6, and low human development takes quite a jump to 59.3. Your life expectancy in those places is 20 years less. 1/4 less. So, just thinking about it too, and like let's kind of zoom out and take like the God view of the world, right? Like just countries that have people that don't live as long can't make as much stuff because the people aren't around long enough to continue to make stuff, or even like they're not around long enough to really get very skilled at it. You know what I mean? And part of that too is their schooling, right? If they're not doing a lot of schooling, then there's not a lot of skilled labor that's happening, right? And what we found is that it's really hard to move out of this low developing, this kind of sphere of low income, low human standards without acquiring, more education, more human capital, more know-how, more how-to, right? Any one of those. And so lastly, let's match this all up with GDP, right? So of course, the lead up here, our GDP, and this is going to be per person, right? So I'm taking the total GDP and I'm dividing it by the people. And so for a very high human development, right, this is going to be $39,000. For a high, it's 14,000. For medium, it's 6,000. And for a low, it's 2,775. What a difference. And these are even like overestimations, right? These are higher values than we would expect because they used US prices for all the goods. So when they calculated the GDP here, they didn't use, because I mean, if you guys have traveled or when you travel, you'll find that, the prices of things in other places are going to be cheaper, right? So even just like, a Lego set that's $30 here might be, the equivalent of $20 somewhere else after the exchange rate, right? And so the pricing of things changes where you are. And so they said, well, let's not use those cheaper prices that might be abroad. we're going to use the US prices when we're calculating this GDP. And so this is even kind of a higher GDP than we could normally maybe expect, right? And so we do see that, you know, it trends well, right, with the other stuff that's going on, but it's not the best measure, right? You know, are these very high, countries, you know, more than twice as well off as the high countries? Like, no, like it seems that way from the GDP per person measure, right? But the other measures, they seem to be very similar. So we just want to be careful. We want to be aware of what this measure is, that it is a good measure, but that it has its flaws. Any questions on that? Okay, cool. So let's talk about unemployment. So we just had a jobs Friday, so where the Bureau of Labor Statistics released unemployment numbers, and they were better than expected, right? In terms of, you know, we still have a lot of people looking for jobs and a lot of people out of work, but you know, we expected there to be more. So what are they talking about when they're talking about that stuff, right? So unemployment. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's just this government body, you know, located in DC. You know, it's kind of like the IRS, but more boring, right? It's called the BLS for short. What do? They estimate both the employment and the unemployment every month. It gets released on a Friday. One of my favorite podcasts, Planet Money, calls it Jobs Friday, so that's what I call it now too. Podcasts, Planet Money. It's short. It's very, like, you know, they explain everything. So when we're talking about the unemployment rate, first of all, we're talking about a population that's age 16 plus. So that's the first thing that we're talking about. And we've got two chunks of people in this 16 plus range. So that actually should have extended there, sorry. We've got two chunks of people that are in this. We've got employed people, and we have unemployed people. And these two together make up that term I was telling you about earlier, the labor force. That's just the employment plus unemployment. But as you can see, my square is not completed because I've got a bunch of old fogies and babies over here and whiners. I've got a bunch of people that are out of the labor force. And so this whole thing is my total population. When I talk about that unemployment rate, what What I'm talking about is I'm talking about the unemployed divided by the labor force, not the population. So this is really important for us to keep in mind. Why? Well, if you can make the denominator lower, then the unemployment rate essentially, so the size of the denominator is going to change your perception of the unemployment rate. And so this labor force, who's included in this and who's included in unemployment is going to be really important. So we're going to look at the BLS website in a second here, because there's over 8 different types, many different types, of unemployment. The one that we're always talked about is the U8. So I think it's out of 12. And so here, let's go ahead and jump to that real quick. And I will share this screen so that I can. To BLS. Not what I want. Okay, I might have to send this out to you guys. I'm also like trying to work on this other screen, which is not fun. Go ahead and duplicate. There we go. Google. I just needed more Google. All right, so we've got, so it wasn't U8. So we use U3. So we'll update that in the notes. So let's talk about these different unemployment rates. So this one is the total employment rate as a percentage of the civilian labor force. And so to be unemployed, according to the BLS, you have to have been out of work and looking for a job for so much of your time. And so if you're just out of work, right? So a person's employed 15 weeks or longer or whatever, right? You don't count unless you're actively looking for a job. So you'll get a random call. It'll be the government. They'll say, hey, we're from the BLS. We're doing this survey, blah, blah, blah. And they'll say, are you employed? You say, no, I'm a student. They say, okay, bye. But if you're not a student, then they say, are you employed? You say, yes. They say, okay, is it part-time? You say, yes. They say, okay, bye. And then, but if you say, no, I'm not employed, they say, okay, well, are you looking for a job? You say, yes, I've been looking for a job. And they say, okay, well, how long have you been looking for a job? And so as long as there's a certain, you have looked for work sometime in the past 12 months. So you are available for a job and you've worked somewhere, you looked for work in the past 12 months. So a marginally attached labor force is someone who's currently neither working or looking for work, but indicate that they want and are available for a job in the last 12 months. So, this is somebody who's maybe given up on the market, right? This happened a lot during the Great Recession. right? And we saw that, yeah, the unemployment rate went down, the official unemployment rate, but if we included the discouraged workers, right, we include those discouraged workers, so the unemployment rate, I'll show you this in a second, is going to be those old unemployed, the kind of plus the discouraged workers over the labor force plus discouraged. So, so it would look like that. So this is the unemployment rate. This is the, so U3, right? I already forgot. 3, 4, 4. So this is U5. This is I would think this is a better measure of unemployment, right? Because it's not just talking about those people that are actively looking for a job. It's talking about the people that are able and willing to have a job, but aren't working for some particular reason. And again, we call them discouraged laborers. So let's go back to our table here. So we have another measure here. I messed it up. It was U3 and U4. So we have another measure here, right? U5, the total unemployed persons plus discouraged workers plus all others marginally attached to the labor force, right? And so what are we talking about by marginally attached to the labor force? So marginally attached to the labor force says right here, oh, so I defined that incorrectly. Discouraged workers are a subset, have given a job market related reason. So marginally attached means you're available, but you're not doing it. So you might be marginally attached because, let's say you're wealthy. Let's say you got a trust fund, or your parents are giving you money, or you're stealing money, or you've got an illegal business or something, right? So you're marginally attached to the labor force. You're not looking for a job, but you want a job. And the reason why you're not looking for a job isn't because you're PO'd at the labor market and think that nobody wants me and I'm not good, I'm not good enough or anything, right? I mean, part of that does happen, right? We're going to talk about the different types of unemployment. Part of that is there's a skills mismatch that happens, right? In terms of you get laid off from your job working in the steel mill or whatever, right? And nobody's hiring steel mill workers. I mean, that happened in Sydney, right? A lot of the people that were working at Cabela's no longer had jobs, and they were unemployed because not through any real fault of their own, but just because of the fact that they didn't have the skills that they used to have were no longer valuable for the jobs that were available in their area or the jobs that they could get. People employed part-time for economic reasons, right? So this is a huge problem in Japan, right? A ton of the Japanese, workforce is involuntarily part-time working, right? And so these are people that want full-time job, but they have to settle for a part-time schedule, right? And so if we wanted to include the discouraged workers and the marginally attached workers and the part-time workers, right, then we start to get a very different impression of unemployment, right? It goes from, it was 3.8 in August. It was actually 7.3 if we include all those extra people. It jumped to 10.5 in August. And this says it actually jumped to almost 17 in August. Now, what do we have over here? Why do we have two different measures? Has anybody ever gotten a job just over the winter break? Or just over the summer? So there's seasonality to working in economic activities, right? People buy way more crap during winter break, around the holidays and stuff, right? People travel a lot more and do a lot more tourist stuff during the summer. And so we have to adjust for that. We have to adjust for the seasons, right? So the fact that there's just more economic activity in the summer and the winter and less in the spring and the fall. And so economists have worked out ways to adjust for that. So you don't really need to know, all it means is if you're looking at these things, the seasonally adjusted ones are going to give you the better measurement when you're they're going to give you the apples to apples, right? Because looking at the non-seasonally adjusted unemployment rate, like in December compared to March, it's always going to be higher in March than December. Because December is that rush where there's going to be a bunch of people that are going to get jobs just for the holidays, right? And so they account for that. Okay. So now I have to do my thing where I do extend again. So the data that we have, that the book has, right, which is the one that we're going to use. So the U.S. unemployment rate, the U.S. employment data. This is from July 2017. So this tells us that we've got 153 million employed in the U.S. We've got 7 million unemployed. We've got a labor force of 160.49 million, right? We just add those two up. We've got a not in the labor force of 255 million people. Those moochers. We've got an unemployment rate, right, which we calculate by just looking at the unemployed over the labor force, right? So an unemployment rate is going to be 4.3% in 2017. And the participation rate, our last thing, right? That's how much of this total population, right? This is my total pop. Labor force plus non-labor force equals total pop. So it's how much of my total population is in the labor force. That's my participation rate. And we see that it is, oh wait, hold on. I had a fudge here. I was like, that's way too many people. What is going on with our demographic shift? Yeah, it's 95 million. That makes way more sense. 95 million. And so when you put them together, the total pop, the working, and this is really the working age total pop. That's going to be 255 million. And so our participation rate is, we look at the number of the labor force, 160, we divide that by the 255, we end up with a 62.9% participation rate. And because of the recent events, right, we've seen some pretty record unemployment rates, right? If we look at it, the first thing that I had, which was a chart of it over time. Right, we can see that, you know, it got pretty gnarly in the depression, or the recession, right, in 2008, which you guys probably don't remember too much. And then boom! Went crazy because of the COVID and everything, right? So all the way up and back. All right. Well, we didn't even get all the way through 5, so I'll cut the test off at 5, and we're just going to have to go faster and pick up 6 and 7 on exam 2. So go ahead and study chapters 1 through 5. The test will open tomorrow. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and send me an email from office hours.